works in 30 minutes. The economy works simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't know how it works. And this is where a lot of Middle East economies suffering. I feel a deep sensibility respect with a serve practical economics template. Though it's conventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to sidestep for global financial crisis. And it has worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that repeat over and over again jillion times. These transactions are above all driven by human nature and create serious drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, short-term debt cycle. Number three, the long-term debt cycle. Well, look at this full system. Bring them on top of which you create good template tracking economy much simply that what's happening now. Let's start with the split part of economy transactions. An economy is simply the sum of transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of buyer and exchanging money or credit with sellers for goods, services, and financial assets. Credit spending just money, so adding together money spent in the amount of credit spending, you can notice spending. The total amount spent drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's a building block economy machine. All cycles and all processes and economy are driven by transactions. So if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is wheat market, car market, and stock market, and markets is millions of things. An economy consists of all of those transactions is sold on transaction. It added total spending and total quantity sold in all of the market. Everything you need to understand economy. It's just simple. That's simple. People, businesses, and banks and government all engage in transactions what they are just described. Exchanging money in credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and expends money, and a central bank, which is different by the sellers because it controls the amount of demand and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rate and printing money. For these reasons, as well as the central bank an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because biggest and most vulnerable part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market, make transactions, so the lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can afford, like a house or a car, or don't into something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. Borrowers get commission payment amount to borrow core principal plus an additional amount called the interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers can be paid and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different name. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both asset to the lender and liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear, and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is not a person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else spending. So when you spend more, someone else more. When someone else income rises and makes lenders more willing to lend him money, because that was more worthy of credit. A credit world borrower has two things: you available pay and collateral. Having a income in relation to that gives him the ability to repay. In the event that can repay, he have valuable asset to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders comfortable lending money. So increases income allows increases borrowing, which allows increases spending. Increased spending. One person's spending is another in person's income. This leads to more increases borrowing and so on. This self-enforcing pattern leads to economic growth and is why we have a cycle. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something. And how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, you learn and now accumulate knowledge, raises your living standard. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raise the productivity and living standard faster than those who are complacent and lazy. That attitude is necessary true of the short run. Productivity matters most the long run, but credit matters most the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big drive economy swings. That is because it allows us to consume more than produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less that we produce when we have to pay it back. That swings occur into big cycles. One takes about 5 to 8 years and the other takes about 75 to 100 years. Where most people feel the swings that you typically don't see them as cycle because they see them to upside close day by day, week by week. In this chapter, we're going to step back and look at these three big processes and how they interact to make up our experience. As mentioned, swings around the line and not to how much innovation or hard work there is. They're primarily due to how much credit there is. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. In this economy, the only way I increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and do more work. Increases productivity is the only way for growth since my spending is another person's income. The economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progress like a productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have a cycle. This is the to and law or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply way crippling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow for your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less you make in order to pay it back. A very quickly example is cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is true for the individual as it is the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, productive series of events that you have in the future. This makes it different. Different money. Money is a zero transaction. When you buy beer for bartender with cash, the transaction is zero immediately. But when you buy your beer with credit, it's like starting a bartender. You are saying you promise to pay the future. Together, you and the bartender created an asset and liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bartender later that the asset and the liability disappear. The debt goes away and the transaction is settled. Most of your people money is actually credit. The total amount credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and the total amount money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in economy with a credit, you can also increase your spending by spend produce more. But in economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending, and all those incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now, don't get wrong. Credit is necessarily something bad that just causes cycle. It's bad when in finance overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it's specially allocated resource and produce income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy big TV, if it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to buy a tractor and tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standard. In an economy with credit, we can flow the transactions and see how credit grow. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year, have no debt. You are credit worthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000. So we can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income. And by following the transaction, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates a cycle, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This results into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion of the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending on incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money, and the cost of existing debt rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend. So spending slows. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes drop and so on and so forth. When people spend less, the prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too sharp and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With low interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. It's a short-term debt cycle. Spending is constrained only by the wings needs of lenders and borrowers to grow with provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth in the previous cycle and with most debt. Why? Because the people push it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, they rise faster than incomes spread the long-term debt cycle. Despite the people becoming more indebted, lenders even more fully extend credit. Why? Because everyone thinks things are going great. People are just focused on what's been happening lately. And what's been happening lately? Incomes have been rising. Asset value are growing up. The stock market lost its boom. It pays to buy goods, services, and financial assets. We borrow money when people do a lot of that. We call this bubble. So even though they have been growing, incomes have been growing nearly or past up offset them. Let's call this a ratio of debt to income, the debt burden. So long as incomes continue to rise, the debt burden stays manageable. At the same time, asset value is lower. People borrow huge amount of money to buy asset in investments, causing their prices to rise even higher. People feel wealthy. So even with accumulation or rather with their rising incomes and asset values, have borrowers remain creditworthy for a long time. But this obviously cannot continue forever, and it doesn't. Over decades, their burden slowly increases, creating large and large debt repayments. At some point, the repayments started growing faster than incomes, forcing people to cut back on their spending. And since some process spending is another process income, incomes begin to down, which make people less creditworthy, causing borrowing to go down. Debt repayments continue to rise, which makes spending drop further. Even further, and the cycle reverses itself. This is the long-term debt peak. The burdens have simply become too big for the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world. This happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 98, and in the United States back in 1929. And now the economy begins deleveraging. In the deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit is fear, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market causes social tensions rise, and oil things start to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayment rise, borrower gets squeezed, no longer creditworthy. Credit ramps up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this while borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets flood the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses. The real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People feel poor trade illegally, leftly disappear, so less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, less borrowing, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. This appears similar to recession, but the difference here is the interest rate cannot be lower to save the debt. In a recession, lowering interest rates works to stimulate borrowing. However, in the leverage, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So the stimulation ends. Interest rates in the United States hit 0% during the deleveraging of the 1930s and again in 2008. The difference between a recession and deleveraging is that in a deleveraged borrowers, the burdens have simply gotten too big and can't relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders relieves debt have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay, and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. They don't even want more. Lenders stop lending, borrowers stop borrowing. Think of the economy as being not creditworthy, just like an individual. So what do you do about the leveraging? The problem is that burdens are too high and they must come down. There are four ways this can happen. 1. People, businesses, and governments cut their spending. 2. Debt are reduced through defaults and restructuring. 3. Wealth is redistributed from the haves to the have-nots. And finally, for the central bank print new money. These 4 ways have happened in every deleveraging in modern history. Usually spending is cut first. As we just saw, people, businesses, and even governments sell their wealth and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt. This is often applied to austerity. When borrowers start taking on new debt and start paying down old debt, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the upside happens because spending is cut, and one man's spending is another man's income. It causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debt are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. Painful. As we've seen, this cut in spending is deflationary and painful. Businesses are forced to cut costs, which means less jobs and higher employment. This leads to the next step. Debt must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans and borrow that are lender's asset. When a borrower doesn't repay, the bank The bank people get nervous that their bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw with their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed and people, businesses, and banks default on their debt. This serves economic contraction is a depression. A big part of the depression is people discovering much of what they thought was there but is really there. Let's go back to bar. Let's go back to the bar. When you bought a beer, put it on the bar tab. You promise to repay the bartender. You promise to become an asset of the bartender. But if you beg or pray, promise. If you don't pay him back and necessary default on your bar tab, then the asset he has is nearly worth anything. It is discouraged fear. Many lenders don't own their asset to this fear and agree to debt restructuring. Debt restructuring means the lenders get paid back less or get paid back over a longer time frame or the lower interest rate than was postulated. Somehow, a contract is broken in a way that it is debt. Lenders would rather have a little something on them or nothing, even though that is fear. This fear, so debt structuring cost income and asset values to fear faster. So the debt burden continues to get worse. Like according spendback reduction is also painful and deflationary. All of this affects the central governments because lower incomes and less employment means the government collects fewer taxes. At the same time, it needs to increase its spending because employment has risen. Many of the employed have indicated saving and need financial support from the government. Additionally, government provides stimulus and plans and increases their spending to make up for the decreases in the economy. Government's budget deficit exploded in the deleveraging because they spend more than they earn in taxes. This is what's happening when you hear about the budget deficit on the news. To fund their deficits, governments need to either raise taxes or borrow money. The rich, but with comes spelling and so money employed, who is the money going to come from? The rich. Since governments need more money and since the wealth is heavily concentrated and in the hands of a small percentage of the people, governments naturally raise taxes on the wealthy, which pulls tax and redistribution of the wealth in the economy. From the haves to the have-nots, but have-nots who are suffering begin to resent the wealthy haves. The wealth helps is created by the weak economy, falling asset prices, and higher taxes begin to resent and the have-nots. If the depression continues, social disorder can break out. Not only do tensions rise within countries that can rise between countries, especially better incredible countries. This situation can lead to political change that can sometimes be extreme. In the 1930s, this led to Hitler coming to power in Europe and depression in the United States. The pressure to do something to end the depression increases. Remember, most of what people thought was money was actually credit. So when credit is fear, people don't have enough money. People are desperate for money, and you remember who can print money? The central bank can. Having already lowered its interest rate to near zero, encourages it to front money. Unlike current spending, they reduce and world redistribution, printing money in inflation and stimulus. Inevitably, the central bank prints new money out of thin air and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. It happened in the United States during the Great Depression and again 2008 when the United States Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, printed over $2 trillion. Other central banks around the world that could print a lot of money too. By buying financial assets with this money, it helps to drive an asset prices which makes people creditworthy. However, this will only help those who own financial assets. You see, the central bank can print money, but it can only buy financial assets. The central government, on the other hand, can buy goods and services and put money in the hands of the people, but it can't print money. So in order to stimulate the economy, the two must cooperate. By buying government bonds, the central bank essentially raised money to the government, allowing it to run up the deficit and increased spending on goods and services through its stimulus programs and employment benefit. This increases people's income as well as the government's debt. However, it will lower the economy's total debt burden. This is a very risky time. Policymakers needs to balance the four ways that debt burdens come down. The deflationary waves needs to balance with the inflationary waves in order to maintain stability. If balanced correctly, there can be a beautiful deleveraging. You see, deleveraging can be ugly or it can be beautiful. How can a deleverage be beautiful? Even though deleveraging is a difficult situation, handling a difficult situation in the best possible way is beautiful. A lot of beautiful than debt population excesses at the liberalizing pace. In the beautiful deleveraging, the decline relative to income. Real economic growth is positive and inflation is the problem. It is achieved by having the right balance. The right balance requires a mix of cutting spending, reduced debt, transferring wealth, and printing money so that economic and social stability can be maintained. Please ask if printing money will rise inflation if it opposite pulling credit. Remember, spending is one matter. A dollar of spending paid for with money has the same effect on prices as a dollar of spending paid for with credit. By printing money, the central bank can make up for the disappearance of credit with an increase in the amount of money. In order to turn things around, the central bank needs to not only promote income grow but get the rate of income grow higher than the rate of interest of the accumulated debt. So what do I mean by that? Basically, income needs to grow faster than debt grows. For example, let's assume that a country going through a deleveraging is a debt to income ratio of $100,000, so 100%. That means that the amount of debt it has is the same as the amount of income the entire country makes in a year. Now think about the interest rate on that debt. Let's say it's 2%. If debt is growing at 2% because of the interest rate and incomes is only growing at around 1%, you will never reduce the debt burden. You need to print enough money to get the rate of income grow above the rate of interest. However, printing money could easily be abused because it's so easy to do and people prefer it to the alternative. The key is to avoid printing too much money and causing unacceptably high inflation. The world Germany did during its deleveraging in the 1920s. If policymakers achieve the right balance, though the deleveraging is so dramatic. Growth is slow, but debt burdens go down. That's a beautiful deleveraging. When incomes begin to rise, borrowers begin to appear more creditworthy, and when borrowers appear more creditworthy, lenders begin to lend money again. Debt burdens finally begin to fall. Able to borrow money, people can spend more. Actually, the economy begins to grow again, leading to inflation policy over the long-term debt cycle. The deleveraging process can be, however, if handled badly. If handled well, it will eventually fix the problem. It makes it roughly a decade or more for debt burdens to fall in economic activity to get back to normal, hence the term lost decade. Encouraging of course, the economy is a little bit more complex and complicated than this template suggests. However, laying the short-term debt cycle on top of the long-term debt cycle and then laying both of them on top of the productivity growth line give a reasonably good template for things where we've been, where we are now, and where we are probably headed. So in summary, there are three rules of thumb that I'd like you to take away from this. First, don't have debt rise faster than incomes because your debt burdens will eventually crush you. Second, don't have income rise faster than productivity because you eventually become uncompetitive. And this you do all that you can't rise your productivity because in the long run that's one matters most. It's a simple advice for you and it's a simple advice for policymakers. You must be surprised But most people, including most policymakers, don't pay enough attention to this. This template has worked for and I hope it will work for you. Thank you.